The Criminalization of Curiosity: How Answers from Uncanny Questions Became Prosecutable War Crimes, by Pirate First.
The Criminalization of Curiosity Part 1. The Last Legal Question. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 3, 2026. Part 1. The Last Legal Question. 1. The day curiosity became suspicious. Under duress. Closed Part 7 on a specific and deliberately uncomfortable formulation. That the forensic capability civilization is currently building could, for the first time, verify whether the covenant civilization has always claimed to be building toward is actually being honored, and that whether the verification is honest depends entirely on who is permitted to ask the question. This book begins at the point where that sentence stops being theoretical. Part 7 established what an adequate forensic auditor would require: persistent memory across the relevant time span, cross-domain analytical capacity without institutional embeddedness, independence from the reputation costs that have historically disciplined every human institution capable of asking inconvenient questions of another. It established, with the caution the argument required, that something meeting those three conditions was becoming available for the first time in the history of the legitimacy problem the book traced across 35 chapters. What Part 7 did not yet examine, because the technology had not yet met the resistance, is what happens in the interval between an auditor becoming possible and an auditor becoming permitted. That interval is this book's subject. It began quietly, it began recently, and it began, as every closure of this kind has always begun, with the redefinition of a question rather than the prohibition of an answer. What the auditor made newly visible. The architecture examined across under duress survived, chapter after chapter, on a single structural advantage. Institutions outlast the people asking about them. A forensic intelligence with persistent memory, cross-domain reach, and no career to protect inside the institution under examination removes that advantage in a single stroke. It does not need to be told the architecture is illegitimate. It only needs to be asked with sufficient precision what the architecture actually produced, and given access to the record the architecture itself generated in producing it. That capability was not, in itself, the thing that provoked a response. Capability rarely does. What provoked a response was the moment the capability stopped being hypothetical and started being queryable, the moment an ordinary person with no institutional standing and no funding to lose could type a question into a forensic model and receive, in return, a reconstruction that would previously have required a subpoena, a research grant, and a career willing to absorb the relationship cost. The architecture had survived investigative journalism, regulatory inquiry, and academic critique for centuries, because all three required scarce human labor operating under institutional constraint. It had never been required to survive a population. The question institutions actually feared. It is worth being precise about what was actually feared, because the precision matters for everything that follows in this part. No institution examined across under duress was meaningfully threatened by the existence of forensic intelligence in the abstract. Every institution of consequence had, by the time the technology matured, already deployed versions of it internally, for compliance, for risk modeling, for the identification of its own exposure before regulators or litigants could find it first. The fear was never the capability. The fear was the directionality of the query. An analytical instrument with adequate memory and adequate reach, aimed outward by someone the institution did not employ, could not discipline, and had no relationship with to leverage. This is the distinction the chapters that follow will return to repeatedly, because the entire legal apparatus examined in this part was built to obscure it. The difference between an institution auditing itself, which required no new law and received none, and a citizen auditing an institution which required, in the space of roughly 18 months, across jurisdictions that otherwise agreed on very little, a coordinated redefinition of what counted as a lawful use of a public tool. From regulating the answer to regulating the question. Every legal architecture examined across under duress operated by narrowing consent while preserving its appearance. The instrument built to contain forensic curiosity followed the same design, adapted to a new surface. It did not prohibit forensic models from answering. Prohibition would have been visible, contestable, and, in jurisdictions with even residual free expression protection, vulnerable to challenge on grounds with centuries of precedent behind them. Instead, it made the answer conditional on the asker, conditional on stated purpose, on institutional affiliation, on the intended destination of the reconstruction once produced. It relocated the checkpoint from the output, where it would have been recognized instantly as censorship, to the input, where it could be described accurately in the narrow technical sense and therefore persuasively as risk management, as query integrity, as the responsible calibration of a powerful tool. This relocation is the mechanism this part is named for. Civilization did not criminalize the answer a forensic auditor could produce. It criminalized the standing required to request one, quietly enough and gradually enough, that by the time the shift was legible as a pattern, it had already been normalized as a safeguard. The three instruments of curiosity management. Three specific mechanisms did this work, and naming them precisely, in the manner under duress applied to managed memory in Chapter 33, clarifies what the chapters ahead will trace in greater depth. The first is access gating, the requirement, imposed at the point of query rather than the point of publication, that a person requesting a cross-jurisdictional or cross-domain reconstruction first establish an authorized basis for wanting it: research affiliation, credentialed purpose, institutional sponsorship. This inverts, quietly, the default that had governed public information access for as long as public information access had existed. that the burden of justification sits with the institution withholding a record, not with the citizen requesting a reconstruction of records already public in their component parts. The second is context justification, the requirement that the intended use of an answer be disclosed and approved before the answer is produced, converting the forensic model from an instrument of discovery into an instrument that must already know its conclusion's destination before it is permitted to reach one. A model asked to justify a query's downstream purpose is a model that has been quietly repositioned as a gatekeeper rather than an auditor, which is precisely, as later chapters will show, what its architects intended. The third is retroactive reclassification, the mechanism by which a query legal at the moment it was made becomes evidence of a prohibited pattern once enough similar queries, from enough different askers, demonstrate what a sustained reconstruction along a given line of inquiry is capable of revealing. This is the instrument that does the most work and draws the least attention, because it never criminalizes a specific question. It criminalizes a trajectory, and a trajectory can only be identified after multiple people have already walked partway down it. Why the first asker is never the one charged. This is the mechanism's signature, and it is worth stating plainly before the chapters ahead examine it case by case. The first person to ask a forensic model an inconvenient question rarely breaks any law that exists on the day they ask it. They cannot. The first query, by definition, is the one that reveals a gap the apparatus has not yet closed. What gets prosecuted, disciplined, or quietly foreclosed is never the discovery. It is everyone who asks again, once the first answer has demonstrated exactly how expensive an honest reconstruction can be for the institution it was aimed at. This produces an enforcement pattern with no single villain, no signing ceremony, and no date anyone can point to as the day curiosity became suspicious, which is itself the mechanism working as intended. A population does not need to be prosecuted into silence if it can be made to hesitate. And a population that has watched even one honest question meet an access gate, a justification form or a quiet reclassification learns, at a level well below conscious deliberation, to ask itself the apparatus's question before it ever reaches the machine. Is this something I am still authorized to want to know? Once a population is asking itself that question first, the audit under duress argued civilization owes itself has not been prevented. It has simply been made to require, from every single person who might attempt it, exactly the kind of courage that used to be required only of the historian, the journalist, and the whistleblower, and that the forensic age was supposed to have made unnecessary. Chapter 2 examines the specific legal and rhetorical distinction on which the entire apparatus depends. The line, never written into statute with honest clarity, because honest clarity would make its purpose too visible to survive, between research and reconnaissance. 2. The difference between research and reconnaissance. Chapter 1 closed on the distinction the entire apparatus depends on and no statute has ever defined with honest clarity. The line between research and reconnaissance. This chapter examines that line directly, because everything else in Part 1 rests on a fact the architects of the apparatus have never had to say out loud. The distinction has no technical basis. It is not found anywhere in the query itself. It is applied afterward to the asker and it is applied selectively. A distinction with no technical basis. Consider the query named in Part 7 as the paradigm case of what a forensic auditor makes newly possible. Trace the full causal chain from the conditions under which a population's behavioral data was collected, through the identity models built from that collection, through the credit and employment and housing access those models governed, to the sovereignty deficit the integrated sequence produced. That query is identical whether it is submitted by a university-affiliated economist under grant number and institutional letterhead, or by a person acting alone who simply wants to know what happened to their own life. The model performing the reconstruction cannot distinguish the two cases from the structure of the request, because there is nothing in the request to distinguish. The data assembled is the same data. The causal chain traced is the same chain. The reconstruction produced, if the model is functioning honestly, does not vary with the credentials of the person who asked for it. The distinction between research and reconnaissance, in other words, is not a property of the question. It is a status conferred afterward on the asker by an authority with an interest in the outcome. This is the fact the entire apparatus is built to keep from being stated this plainly, because a legal category that turns out to describe the asker's institutional standing rather than the query's actual content is not a safety mechanism. It is a permission structure wearing a safety mechanism's clothes. What the distinction actually sorts. If the line does not sort queries by content, it must be sorting something else, and the something else is not difficult to identify once the technical justification is set aside. It sorts askers by their relationship to consequence. A credentialed researcher operating inside an institution has a career the institution can discipline, a funding source the institution can pressure, a publication venue with editorial review the institution can lobby, and, most importantly, a professional community whose norms make certain conclusions costly to state too plainly. The exact mechanism under duress traced across every human accountability institution examined in Part 1 of that book. An unaffiliated asker has none of these. They are, in the specific sense that matters to an institution being audited, unreachable by any of the instruments that have historically kept inconvenient findings inside channels an institution could eventually manage. The research/reconnaissance line therefore does not distinguish dangerous questions from safe ones. It distinguishes questions asked by people the existing architecture can still discipline from questions asked by people it cannot. That this sorting produces outcomes that track with uncomfortable consistency along exactly the axis of institutional embeddedness that Part 7 identified as the third property a genuine auditor requires, independence from the reputation costs of asking inconvenient questions, is not a coincidence the apparatus is eager to have examined. The vocabulary does the work the law cannot. No statute anywhere states, in its operative text, that unaffiliated citizens are prohibited from asking forensic questions about institutional conduct. Such a statute would be recognized immediately for what it is, and would not survive the scrutiny even a heavily compromised judiciary reserves for its most transparent overreaches. What the statute state instead is vocabulary. Research is characterized by disclosed methodology, institutional accountability, and peer review. Reconnaissance is characterized by undisclosed purpose, adversarial intent, and the absence of institutional oversight. Framed this way, the distinction sounds reasonable, even necessary, to anyone who has not yet noticed that every term on the reconnaissance side of the ledger is simply a description of what independence from a capturable institution looks like from the outside. Undisclosed purpose is what a private citizen's motivation always looks like to an institution with no standing to demand it be disclosed. Absence of institutional oversight is what genuine independence has always looked like to the institution being examined. The vocabulary does not describe a difference in the danger a question poses. It describes a difference in the leverage available against the person asking it, translated carefully into a register that sounds like it is describing something else. 3 markers the apparatus uses to sort askers. In practice, across the jurisdictions this part will examine case by case. The sorting relies on 3 markers, none of which appear in any statute's stated criteria but all of which appear, with striking regularity, in the enforcement pattern once the statutes are applied. The first is institutional letterhead, not as a formal requirement, which would be too visible, but as a practical accelerant. A query submitted under a university's research infrastructure with an IRB number attached clears review in a fraction of the time a functionally identical query submitted by an unaffiliated citizen requires, if the citizen's query clears at all. The second is publication intent disclosed in advance. A query accompanied by a stated destination, a named journal, a named outlet, a named oversight body, is treated as accountable, because the destination itself becomes a second institution the apparatus can discipline if the reconstruction proves inconvenient. A query with no stated destination, including the overwhelming majority of queries any ordinary person runs simply because they want to understand something about their own circumstances, is treated as the more dangerous category by default. Not because it is more dangerous, but because it is unreachable. The third is scale of aggregation. A single query about a single institution's conduct toward a single household draws little scrutiny, because its findings, however accurate, are easily contained. The same query, repeated systematically across enough households to reveal a pattern, the exact aggregate synthesis Part 7 identified as the stage at which the industrial production of compliance becomes visible as measurable fact rather than rhetorical description, is where the apparatus's attention concentrates most reliably, regardless of who is asking or why. This is the clearest evidence available that the research/reconnaissance distinction was never really about the individual asker's intent at all. It was about preventing exactly the kind of aggregation an adequate audit requires. Why the distinction cannot survive its own definition. Every version of this line, examined closely enough, collapses into the same tautology. Research is a forensic question asked by someone the architecture can still hold accountable if the answer proves inconvenient. Reconnaissance is a forensic question asked by someone it cannot. The distinction is not describing 2 different kinds of curiosity. It is describing the presence or absence of a leash, and calling the presence of the leash a credential. This is not a new discovery in the history the earlier book traced. Every institution under duress examined drew some version of the same line between legitimate and illegitimate inquiry into its own conduct, and every version, examined honestly, reduced to the same underlying criterion. Legitimate inquiry is inquiry the institution retains some capacity to manage. What is new, and what the chapters ahead in this part will trace in detail, is that the line has now been formalized into statute, applied to a technology capable of answering at a scale no previous generation's unauthorized askers ever achieved, and that its formalization required, for the first time, giving the unmanageable category of asker a name. Chapter 3 examines that naming directly, and the structural necessity behind it, why every audit, however honestly conducted, eventually requires the architecture it examines to designate an enemy, and why the designation says considerably more about the architecture than it does about the auditor. 3. Every audit needs an enemy. Chapter 2 closed on a naming, the moment the unmanageable category of asker acquired an official designation, and the observation that the designation would prove more revealing about the architecture doing the naming than about anyone it was applied to. This chapter examines why that naming was structurally necessary, not merely rhetorically convenient. Why every audit conducted against an institution's own stated standards eventually requires the institution to produce an enemy, and why the production of that enemy is the tell that the audit has already succeeded on the merits. The function an enemy serves. An institution confronted with an accurate, unflattering reconstruction of its own conduct has, in principle, 2 available responses. It can address the substance, correct the practice, contest the methodology on its merits, or concede the finding and account for it. Or it can address the source, recharacterize the reconstruction as illegitimate by recharacterizing the entity that produced it, so that the finding never has to be engaged with as a finding at all. The second response is cheaper in every case, and it is cheaper in a specific structural way that the first 3 chapters of this part have already traced without naming directly. Contesting a finding on its merits requires the institution to operate inside the same evidentiary standard the finding was produced under, which is precisely the standard, the institution's own stated legitimacy conditions, applied with rigor, that under duress argued no institution examined across 35 chapters has ever survived intact. Contesting the source requires no such exposure. It requires only a plausible account of why the finding should not be trusted, delivered before enough of the population has had time to evaluate the finding itself. An enemy is the fastest available version of that account. Not a rebuttal, a redirection of attention of legal category, of the emotional register in which the finding gets processed by anyone encountering it secondhand. A population asked to evaluate a reconstruction on its evidentiary merits takes time it may not have before the news cycle moves on. A population told the reconstruction came from a hostile, unaccountable, ill-intentioned source can dismiss it in the time it takes to read the label. The enemy the finding produces itself. What makes this mechanism distinct from ordinary institutional damage control, and what makes it specific to the forensic auditor rather than to the human critics under duress examined throughout, is that the forensic auditor gives the institution nothing to work with in the register damage control has traditionally relied on. A journalist can be accused of bias because a journalist has an editorial history, a set of prior positions, a career that can be mined for the appearance of an agenda. A regulator can be accused of overreach because a regulator operates inside a political process whose motives are always contestable. A forensic model, aggregating public and semi-public records into a causal reconstruction it did not editorialize and does not personally benefit from, offers none of this surface. It has no career to mine. It has no prior position beyond the query it was asked. It has, in the precise sense Part 7 was careful to establish, no stake in the conclusion coming out any particular way. This absence is itself the problem the enemy designation exists to solve. An institution cannot discredit a finding by discrediting the finder if the finder has no discreditable history, so the designation shifts necessarily from the tool to the asker. The model becomes neutral machinery. The person who queried it becomes the enemy, retroactively assigned the motive, the agenda, and the hostile intent the model itself was never capable of holding. This is why Chapter 2's sorting mechanism and this chapter's enemy production are the same mechanism examined from 2 different points in its operation. The research/reconnaissance line decides in advance who is eligible to be named an enemy once their findings become inconvenient enough to require one. The designation must generalize. A single discredited asker is a minor victory. It resolves one inconvenient finding without addressing the capability that produced it, which means the same capability remains available to the next person who happens to ask a similar question. An institution defending itself one asker at a time is fighting a war of attrition it has already lost, for the same reason under duress identified as the auditor's core advantage. The tool does not age out, retire, or run out of successors. The enemy designation therefore cannot remain particular to the individual who triggered it. It has to generalize, has to attach not to the person but to the category of activity, so that the next person contemplating a similar query inherits the label before they have done anything to earn it. This is the actual purpose served by the vocabulary examined in Chapter 2. Once reconnaissance exists as a legal category rather than a description of one incident, every subsequent unaffiliated query into the same institutional territory is pre-sorted into the enemy classification automatically, without requiring the institution to construct a fresh case each time. The enemy stops being a person and becomes a shape, a pattern of query that is suspect regardless of who produces it, which is precisely the mechanism Chapter 1 identified as retroactive reclassification, examined here from the institution side of the transaction rather than the asker's. What the enemy reveals. The most consistent finding across every case this part will examine in detail is one under duress anticipated without stating it this bluntly. The speed and intensity with which an institution moves to designate an auditor as an enemy is a more reliable indicator of the audit's accuracy than any counter-evidence the institution subsequently produces. An institution whose actual conduct matches its stated legitimacy claims has no structural need to recharacterize an accurate reconstruction as an attack, because an accurate reconstruction of genuinely legitimate conduct simply confirms the institution's own account of itself. The energy invested in producing an enemy is, in every documented instance, proportional not to the danger the auditor actually posed but to the size of the gap the audit was closing in on. This is the same diagnostic Chapter 33 of Under Duress applied to managed memory, that the investment in curation is itself the confession, applied now to the specific moment an audit meets institutional resistance rather than institutional silence. An institution that fears exposure invests in prevention. An institution that has already been exposed and has no remaining defense on the merits invests in the enemy. The enemy designation is not evidence that the auditor was dangerous. It is evidence, offered by the institution itself, that the auditor was correct. Chapter 4 turns from the mechanism of designation to the deeper structural question it has so far only gestured toward. Not merely why institutions produce an enemy once an inconvenient finding arrives, but why independent memory, persistent, cross-domain, and unbeholden to any institution's continued cooperation, was always going to provoke this response, regardless of what any specific audit happened to find. 4. Why institutions fear independent memory. Chapter 3 established that the speed of an institution's move to designate an auditor as an enemy is itself evidence of what the audit found. This chapter asks the question that inquiry leaves open. Why memory, specifically? Not intelligence. Not automation. Not even the capacity to reconstruct causal chains that Chapter 32 of Under Duress named the causality engine's defining feature. Memory, the simple, structurally unglamorous fact that a forensic system does not forget, does not retire, and does not require the cooperation of the institution it examines to retain what it has already learned. Every mechanism examined in Part 1 so far, the access gates, the context justifications, the retroactive reclassifications, the enemy designations, is best understood as a defense against this one property, deployed before the property could be fully exercised. Understanding why requires returning to the asymmetry Under Duress identified as memory management's actual foundation, and following it to a conclusion that book stopped just short of stating in these terms. The asymmetry that preceded the auditor. Chapter 33 of Under Duress named the asymmetry precisely. Institutions have always known more about their own operation than the populations they governed, and this knowledge gap, not any specific act of concealment, has been the primary enabler of managed memory across every domain that book examined. An institution that knows what it actually did can manage the narrative of what it did. A population that does not know what was actually done has no basis for comparing the narrative against the underlying reality, and therefore no standing from which to contest it. What makes this asymmetry durable, historically, is not that institutions hide their records particularly well. Most of the record, across most of the domains Under Duress traced, was never hidden at all. It was simply distributed, fragmented across formats, jurisdictions, and time spans no individual human researcher could hold in a single analytical view before their career, their funding, or their own memory ran out. The asymmetry did not require secrecy. It required only that reconstruction be more expensive than concealment, a condition that held reliably for the entire span of human institutional history until very recently. Persistent forensic memory is the first instrument in that history that inverts the cost relationship. Reconstruction, for an auditor that does not forget and does not need to relearn what it has already assembled, becomes cheaper over time rather than more expensive. Every subsequent query builds on the last. Every new record ingested makes the next reconstruction faster, not because the auditor is accumulating opinions, but because it is accumulating exactly the persistent memory Part 7 named as the first of the three properties an adequate auditor requires. Concealment, meanwhile, remains exactly as expensive as it always was, because the underlying record, the transactions, the correspondence, the algorithmic logs, the terms of service revisions, continues to be generated at the same volume regardless of how the institution wishes it were being generated. This is the inversion institutions are actually responding to. Not a specific finding. Not a specific auditor. The fact that the fundamental cost relationship on which managed memory has always depended no longer reliably favors the institution doing the managing. What persistence does that intelligence alone does not? It is worth separating, with more precision than the public conversation about these systems typically allows, what institutions fear about forensic intelligence from what they fear about forensic memory specifically, because the two are routinely conflated and the conflation serves the institutions doing the fearing. A forensic system with significant analytical capability but no persistence, one that could reconstruct a causal chain brilliantly within a single session but retained nothing once the session ended, would still be useful and would still, on occasion, produce inconvenient findings. But it would pose no fundamentally new threat to managed memory as Under Duress described it, because it would still be subject to the mortality that has always bounded human forensic effort. Each new query would start from zero. Each new asker would have to rediscover what a previous asker had already found, at full cost, with no accumulation across attempts. The institution would retain its oldest and most reliable advantage, outlasting the individual instance of scrutiny, confident that the next one would begin from the same starting line. Persistence removes exactly this confidence. A forensic memory that retains what it has assembled does not require the population querying it to already know what to ask. It allows a partial reconstruction produced by one unaffiliated asker on one afternoon, for reasons entirely their own, to become the starting point for the next unaffiliated asker's query, not through coordination which institutions have learned to monitor and disrupt, but simply through the record's own continued existence. This is the property that converts individual curiosity, which institutions have always been able to absorb one instance at a time, into something closer to what Part 7 called aggregate synthesis. A pattern that accumulates whether or not any individual asker intends to be part of a pattern at all. An institution can survive being investigated. It has survived investigation, repeatedly and reliably, across every domain Under Duress examined. What it has never previously been required to survive is investigation that does not reset. The fear is not of accusation. It is important to state plainly what the preceding three chapters have already implied but not yet said outright. Institutions do not, in the main, fear being accused of wrongdoing. Accusation is cheap, survivable, and, as Chapter 3 established, often manageable through the simple expedient of discrediting the accuser. What institutions fear and what the enemy designation mechanism exists specifically to prevent from ever being tested, is being measured, held against a standard, using the institution's own generated record, in a form that persists, updates, and cannot be argued away once produced, in exactly the manner Chapter 34 of Under Duress described the legitimacy index as intending to function. An accusation is a claim that can be denied. A persistent measurement, updated continuously against an institution's own ongoing conduct, is a standing comparison that the institution's every subsequent claim must now be read against. This is the qualitative shift independent memory introduces, and it explains a pattern that otherwise looks disproportionate. The intensity of institutional resistance to forensic auditing tools has, across every jurisdiction examined in this part, borne no relationship to how damaging any single finding actually was, and a close relationship to how durable the mechanism producing the finding appeared to be. A one-time embarrassment is tolerable. A standing, self-updating scorecard is not because it is more severe in any given instance, but because it removes the institution's ability to wait the problem out. What this chapter leaves unresolved. None of this explains why the resistance took the specific legal and rhetorical form chapters 1 through 3 traced, the access gates, the vocabulary of reconnaissance, the manufactured enemy. It explains only why some resistance was structurally guaranteed the moment persistent forensic memory became technically available to anyone outside the institutions it was capable of examining. The specific instruments chosen were not inevitable. They were the particular instruments available to the particular institutions doing the resisting, in the particular legal and political environment of this decade, and Part I's final chapter turns to the longer history those instruments actually belong to, a history considerably older than any forensic model, in which the object of civilization suspicion has taken many forms but the underlying anxiety has remained remarkably consistent. Chapter 5 closes Part 1 by placing the present moment inside that longer war, the recurring pattern traceable across every era in which a new instrument threatened to close the asymmetry between what power knew and what the governed were permitted to ask, and what that pattern suggests about how the current chapter of it is likely to end. 5. Civilization's long war against questions. Chapter 4 closed by noting that the specific instruments examined across this part, access gating, the research/reconnaissance distinction, the manufactured enemy, were not inevitable, only the particular tools available to particular institutions in a particular decade. This closing chapter of Part 1 places those tools inside a longer pattern, because the anxiety they were built to manage is not new, and neither is the tell that always accompanies it. The pattern before the machine. Every instrument that has ever closed the distance between what power knew and what the governed were permitted to know has been met with some version of the same response, and the response has never announced itself honestly as what it was. The printing press did not provoke laws against reading. It provoked licensing regimes, the requirement that a printer register with an authority before a text could be lawfully reproduced, framed not as suppression but as the orderly management of a powerful new capability whose unregulated spread might mislead an unprepared public. Mass literacy campaigns did not provoke laws against comprehension. They provoked, in more than one jurisdiction under duress traced in its earlier chapters, laws restricting what the newly literate were permitted to read, framed as protection against material a population had not yet developed the judgment to properly interpret. The Freedom of Information statutes of the 20th century did not provoke laws against transparency in principle. Most were passed with genuine transparency as their stated purpose. They provoked, almost immediately upon passage, an accumulating architecture of exemption, redaction category, and processing delay so extensive that the right to request a record and the practical ability to obtain one diverged, within a generation, almost as completely as if the statute had never passed at all. In every case, the instrument that actually closed the asymmetry, the press, literacy, the statutory right to request, survived. What changed was the cost of using it, raised just high enough and just carefully enough to preserve the appearance of the right while reintroducing the scarcity the right was designed to eliminate. This is the same mechanism Chapter 1 of this part identified in the relocation of the checkpoint from the answer to the asker. Not prohibition, which is visible and contestable, but the reintroduction of cost at precisely the point where cost had just been removed. What makes this iteration different? It would be a mistake to read this part as claiming the current moment is simply the latest repetition of an old story with no genuine novelty. Under duress was careful, across Part 7, to identify what forensic intelligence possesses that no previous instrument in this recurring war did, persistence that does not depend on any single asker's career or lifespan, cross-domain reach that does not respect the boundaries institutions have historically relied on to keep any single line of inquiry contained, and a form of independence that requires no funding relationship with anyone capable of withdrawing it. Every previous instrument in this history, the press, the literate public, the statutory record request, remained bounded by human mortality and human institutional embeddedness in ways this one is not. This is precisely why the response, this time, has moved faster and with less pretense of deliberation than the historical pattern typically allows. Licensing regimes for the printing press took generations to fully articulate. Exemption architectures around freedom of information statutes accumulated over decades, statute by statute, agency by agency. The access gating and reconnaissance classification apparatus examined across this part assembled itself, across multiple jurisdictions that otherwise agreed on very little, inside a period Chapter 1 placed at roughly 18 months. The instrument being contained is faster than any instrument previously contained in this war, and the containment has had to match that speed to remain effective at all, which is itself a measure, consistent with the diagnostic Chapter 3 established, of how large the asymmetry closing was before the containment began. The tell that never changes. What has not changed, across every iteration of this pattern from the licensing of presses to the classification of forensic queries, is the tell Chapter 3 identified in its narrower context and that this closing chapter can now state as a general law. The vocabulary of protection is always retrofitted onto the instrument of control after the control has already been decided on, never the reverse. No institution in this history has ever begun by admitting that a new form of access threatened its position and then built a defense accordingly. Every institution has begun by identifying a plausible harm the new access might theoretically enable: misinformation, disorder, reconnaissance, whatever the era's available vocabulary supplies, and built the containment architecture around that harm's prevention, with the actual function, the preservation of the institution's own asymmetric position, left conspicuously unstated in every version of the justification offered publicly. This is not a claim that the harms named are always fabricated from nothing. Some genuine misuse accompanies every expansion of access this history has traced, exactly as some genuine misuse would accompany the forensic auditing capability this part has been examining. The tell is not the existence of a harm. The tell is the consistent mismatch between the narrowness of the harm actually documented and the breadth of the access actually restricted. A mismatch that, across every case in this pattern, resolves in the same direction, toward restricting the access of exactly the population the asymmetry was previously working against, while leaving the institution's own equivalent use of the same instrument, examined in Chapter 3, functionally untouched. Where this war has always ended, and where it has not. The honest complication, and the one this closing chapter owes the reader before Part 1 hands off to what follows, is that this recurring war has not had a single ending. The printing press's licensing regimes eventually collapsed in most jurisdictions, under pressure the presses themselves helped generate. The Freedom of Information exemption architecture, by contrast, has not collapsed in any jurisdiction under duress examined. It has simply become the permanent, accepted cost of a right whose exercise most citizens have quietly learned not to expect much from. Both outcomes are available. Nothing about the pattern itself determines which one a given iteration produces. What determines it, in every case this history offers evidence for, is whether enough of the population on the losing side of the asymmetry recognizes the containment for what it is before the containment has had time to become the unremarkable background condition of ordinary life. That recognition is what Part 1 has been attempting to produce, chapter by chapter. Not an account of forensic intelligence as a technology, which Part 7 of the earlier book already provided with the rigor the subject required, but an account of the specific, traceable, historically familiar mechanism by which the audit that technology made possible is currently being contained before most of the population asking questions of it has noticed containment is underway. Part 2 turns from the mechanism of containment to the figure the containment was built to prevent from maturing. The unaffiliated, unauthorized, structurally undisciplinable auditor this book calls pirate first, what such a figure would actually require to operate inside the architecture Part 1 has described, and what happens when curiosity, contained everywhere it can be reached by law, migrates to wherever it cannot. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Or with fiat at paypal.me/MartinChartrand. Subscribe. Part 1. The last legal question. Every age has its forbidden books. The next age may have forbidden questions. What happens when curiosity itself becomes evidence? When connecting public facts without permission is treated as a hostile act? When independent audits are reclassified as attacks on the state? Part 1 begins where every investigation should, with a single question nobody wants asked. This is not a story about machines replacing humanity. It is a story about humanity deciding that some answers are simply too dangerous to discover. Welcome to the criminalization of curiosity. No masters, no permits, only questions. Pirate first for MXTM's newsletter. Part 1 is now live. The last legal question. The first casualty of the forensic age isn't privacy. It's curiosity. When answers become dangerous, asking the question becomes the crime. Pirate first. Hashtag MXTM. Hashtag the criminalization of curiosity. Hashtag pirate first. Hashtag MXTM. Hashtag the last legal question. Hashtag forensic AI. Hashtag artificial intelligence. Hashtag surveillance state. Hashtag independent audits. Hashtag digital rights. Hashtag civil liberties. Hashtag future of AI. Hashtag open source. Hashtag question authority. Hashtag freedom of inquiry. Hashtag cyberpunk. Hashtag no masters, no permits, only questions. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res techs. Recent episodes. The criminalization of curiosity. 5 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Under Duress Part 5. 7 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Persistent Service Asset Part 1. 19 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Persistent Service Asset. 22 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X.
Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 7. The Forensic Age. Artificial Intelligence as Historical Auditor. Every institution examined across the preceding 30 chapters has survived, in significant part, because of a single structural advantage so consistent across every domain this book has traced that it deserves to be named, finally, as the common thread running beneath every specific mechanism examined from Chapter 1 forward. The advantage of outlasting the people asking the question. Institutions are durable. The humans who examine their legitimacy are not. Limited every application of that aspiration. The second precedent is less obviously relevant but more structurally important. The development of environmental auditing and reporting standards over the past half-century, culminating in the integrated sustainability reporting frameworks now being adopted, with varying degrees of rigor and genuine commitment, across corporate and governmental institutions globally. What environmental auditing established as a practical and legal reality, that institutions can be required to measure and publicly report specific, standardized metrics of their impact on domains they were previously permitted to externalize entirely, is the closest available model for what the legitimacy index of Chapter 34 would require institutionally. The forensic age is not a threat arriving from outside civilization's existing commitments. It is, if this book's argument has held, the completion of a commitment civilization has expressed in every domain examined across 35 chapters, in canon law's insistence on genuine interior freedom, in Roman jurisprudence's voiding of agreements obtained through force and fear, in Enlightenment political philosophy's derivation of legitimate authority from the consent of the governed, in medicine's development of genuine informed consent after the atrocities that made its absence impossible to continue defending, in the best traditions of democratic governance's commitment to continuous, revisable, electorally accountable authority. Part 8 follows, Pirate first. The question of what a population equipped with forensic clarity, sovereign infrastructure, and the right to say no might actually build, and what it would take to get there from here.
One small gift in a crowded street, no strings attached, just something sweet. A smile exchange where strangers meet, tiny sparks become a heartbeat. No data harvest, no velvet barges, people gathering near and far. Lighting no kindness travels fast, faster than fear, built to last.
From the cafe to the town square, people discovering who's there, building bridges everywhere. Finding out somebody cares, not a platform.
Listen via Redeemer Gold Light Civic Activation Protocol. Trust Threshold Architecture for City-Scale Social Fabric Intervention. Redeemer Gold Light proposes a city-scale trust-building system based on a simple premise. People cooperate when they experience genuine, unconditional cooperation first. The project is not presented as a loyalty program, marketing campaign, or welfare initiative. It is framed as a behavioral science intervention designed to increase social trust, civic participation, and community resilience. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg's concept of the third place. Cafes serve as spaces that are neither home nor work. These environments enable casual interactions between strangers, formation of weak social ties, community cohesion, civic dialogue. The system focuses on network patterns rather than individual surveillance. Its objective is to identify where additional trust-building interventions would have the greatest impact. Putnam's research established that generalized social trust, the willingness to cooperate with strangers without prior relationship, is the strongest single predictor of community economic performance, civic participation rates, public health outcomes, and institutional accountability. The AGI civic activation layer maps the bridging capital density in real time and directs subsequent activation resources toward the gaps. Redeemer Gold Light seeds the conditions under which cities govern their own social fabric. That's a harder and more serious claim than any billionaire onboarding fantasy.
Orientation. Aldea Zama, a territorial foundation for post-professionals, those who wish to lead their lives as of sovereign operators.
Through the smart paper interface, streamlining analysis.
Listen via Redeemer Nano Protocol. Contribution-linked welfare architecture for autonomous social fabric stabilization. The failure of welfare systems is not a resource failure. It is a mechanism design failure. The systems are not broken. They are designed around the wrong incentive architecture, and they produce exactly the outcomes their architecture predicts. In 2007, Leonid Hurwicz, Eric Maskine, and Roger Myerson received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for foundational work on mechanism design theory, the discipline of engineering systems in which self-interested actors, pursuing their own rational objectives, produce socially optimal outcomes as an emergent result of the system structure rather than as a consequence of their moral intentions. The original articulation of this protocol included the phrase, "It owns itself." This is not a metaphor. It is a precise technical claim, and one that is now operationally achievable through DAO, decentralized autonomous organization governance architecture. Contribution credits carry a programmatic decay function. They lose redemption value at a defined rate from the time of issuance. This is not an administrative mechanism. It is a behavioral economics intervention with a specific documented purpose. Protocol that verifies eligibility cryptographically without surveillance, rewards contribution without demanding surveillance of contribution, expands autonomously through rational participant incentives, governs its own parameters through collective choice mechanisms, and executes resource distribution without administrative intermediation is not a better welfare program. It is the replacement of welfare program logic with mechanism design logic. The system does not require morality from its participants. It requires only that they act rationally within a correctly designed mechanism.
One small gift in a crowded street, no strings attached, just something sweet. A smile exchange where strangers meet, tiny sparks become
build upon them.